Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode in my series for October of Integral Spirituality. Today we're going to look more closely at this level of spiritual development and talk specifically about how this level sees the divine. Welcome to the Deep Psychology Podcast. I'm your host Ross Edwards, author, coach and podcaster. We cover deep insights into your psychology, helping you grow in psyche and spirit. Make sure to subscribe to Deep Psychology on Spotify or Apple to stay up to date. You can also visit the website deep-psychology.com, visited by tens of thousands of people every month for lots of free resources. If you want to go deeper with this work, you might like to do coaching with me. Head to the website for more details. It's time for today's episode. Okay, so as you know, if you've been following along since the start of September, when I did my series on the levels of spirituality, we are now covering in depth in October a phase of spiritual development that is starting to become prevalent. It's like the next big thing, you might say informally. Postmodern spirituality came online in the West about 60, 70 years ago, and it has dominated at the cutting edge of spiritual culture. And now what is starting to emerge is called integral spirituality, which looks quite different to postmodern spirituality. And in October on Sundays, what we're going to do is pick it apart and really understand it, get a grip on what it really is. Okay, so today what we're going to look at specifically regarding integral spirituality is how you might see the divine when you are in an integral spiritual phase. Okay, and what we're going to do here in this episode is logically link several things together. So there's going to be sort of the main insights of integral spirituality. Then we're going to sort of work out, what are the deductions, what are the conclusions, what are the results of these fundamental insights of integral spirituality. But what I want you to kind of take away with you, and this is true whenever we're talking about stages of development, is that stages of development aren't something we reason our way into. They're not something that we choose to go through necessarily. It's more like your perception of the world changes, and all of a sudden you see things in a different way, and everything else comes from that. Once you move into the stage, then everything else transforms. And at a certain point, I've thought about these topics for many years, and what I've realised is that at a certain point you have to just kind of accept that these are the characteristics of the stage, and there are certain axiomatic truths about the stage that aren't really reducible to anything else. And I think that's important because, yes, we're going to be logically understanding things and seeing how the insights of this phase and the views of it are related and how they link together, but ultimately there are some axiomatic truths at the heart of integral spirituality that cannot be reduced to anything else. Okay? So also remember that I said in last week that this stage is similar to each of the previous stages of development in a certain way, but it's very different as well. And so you can look and you'll see similarities between this stage and traditional and modern and postmodern spirituality, but you'll also see things that are different, and it'll help you understand what integral spirituality is and how it is different from each of the prior stages, and how perhaps it doesn't fall into the same traps that they do. It certainly isn't perfect, and at the end of this episode we're going to talk about sort of the contradictions of it, which are things that I've only just started to become aware of. And you'll see that even this is not the end point of human development. So, integral spirituality is buttressed by the integral worldview, which basically sees the world and human beings as evolving in all domains, whether it's biological, it's societal, it's cultural, psychological, moral, aesthetic. It's evolving in all dimensions, broadly over time. It doesn't mean that we don't have difficulties and problems and that life is perfect. No, but there is an evolution going on. And this goes back way beyond past human civilization into the past, before life, really all the way back to the Big Bang. So that's one of the sort of axiomatic truths about the integral worldview. And you can look for reasons why that is the case, but I think this is one that you have to just kind of accept. You just have to kind of accept that when you're at an integral worldview, you just see that the world is an evolving thing in all these dimensions and more. And that this will ultimately affect your spirituality. Of course it will. So, another of these axiomatic truths of integral spirituality is that it sees divinity to be both transcendent and immanent. Now, traditional spirituality tends to see it as purely transcendent. God is in heaven and we're all down here in hell kind of thing. Modern spirituality doesn't really see a divinity, and it doesn't believe in a transcendent. It sees everything to be immanent. It's sort of the pendulum swings completely. Postmodern, bit of both, I think, without maybe sort of the same rigor as integral spirituality may have. Integral spirituality, where we really perceive that divinity is both transcendent, that is, we cannot limit it. We can't say the divinity is this or it's that. We cannot square the circle. We can't just add up lots of things in the universe around us and in ourselves and in the world and make a picture of the divine that is accurate, because it is ultimately a transcendent thing. However, it is immanent because ultimately it is the ground of absolutely everything, and it is not separate from this world. In fact, the world is infused with the divine. And this might sound a bit abstract, but again, this is I think it's one of these axiomatic truths of integral spirituality. To go a bit more deeper into this, we can say that divinity is essentially infinite, quote-unquote, nothingness. It's pure consciousness, it's pure substrate, it's pure beingness, and it's self-conscious. And so because of this, no sort of object, no concept, nothing can express it or describe it or lead you to experiencing it. Okay, that's why it is transcendent. Okay, and also, of course, when you experience the divine, it has a very transcendent quality to it. And if you've had a spiritual experience of any kind in your life, it's likely that you felt that. So that's why it's transcendent, but at the same time, it is the ground and source of all manifestation. All right? So it's not separate from manifestation. It really, the way, manifestation is the expression of the infinite, of divinity. We're going to come back to this. So if we put these together, the idea that the world is evolving and that divinity is both transcendent and immanent, what we can say, and again, this is not a logical deduction that you make. I'm just sort of showing you how the pieces fit together to help you kind of get your head around it. But this is not like a logical deduction, right? But what you perceive at integral spirituality, once you've reached this stage, is that the world is sort of the evolving expression of the divine, okay? The world is the evolving expression of the divine. And the divine is sort of both the source of evolution and the final result at the same time. It's not one or the other. It's both at the same time, because God is both transcendent and immanent. So listen, that alone is an extraordinarily profound statement. And it sounds very philosophical and abstract, but I think what's key and what is really transformative is when you try to really see things like this. Our tendency is not really to see the world as divine and as an evolving expression of the divine. Our tendency is usually to judge the world. Certainly at prior stages of development, traditional, modern, postmodern, all have their ideas of how the world should be and how the world is not as it should be. When we see that the world is an evolving expression of the divine, there's a love that comes around. And it's not necessarily that we have to tolerate everything and that we don't have to take a stand and say, well, this is right and this is wrong. But I feel like there's a deeper understanding. Like when I think of the world and I think of, where's society going, what's happening with AI, what's happening with Donald Trump, what's happening with the Middle East, what's happening with Putin, and all of this stuff, it's like, yes, I can see the chaos on the surface, but underneath that there is the evolution of that world, and there is there is divinity which is really driving it all, and it is all of it at once. And that is where my trust goes now. I don't really trust in a particular political figure, but I also don't get overly triggered by them, because I realize that ultimately things are evolving and I can trust in that. And this is an ongoing practice for me, but when it gets to that level, I think you're really starting to get this down to the marrow of your bones, and it's really starting to be transformative. So this relationship to the divine is not an intellectual thing. It's something that you have to slowly embody over time. And you might wonder, well, how does the finite and the infinite relate to evolution? What exactly is evolving? And here's the conclusion that I've come to with the help of lots of study, like Ken Wilber, Steve McIntosh, and integral philosophers like that. The basic conclusion is that the infinite cannot evolve in essence, because the infinite is the infinite, right? So it cannot evolve in essence, right? It is fundamentally remains infinite and perfect regardless of what happens. However, its finite expression, the finite world, which is an expression of God, I've actually, in my recent book, I called it the dewdrop that is suspended in God, which is possibly an episode for another day. The finite world is evolving, but the infinity cannot evolve. Divinity cannot evolve, but in creating the finite and expressing itself through the finite, it basically creates an evolving world. And we can basically say that from this point of view, the point of the finite world is to evolve and to reach greater levels of perfection and beauty, right? So how does this relate to humans, you might think? We're talking, it seems like very abstract. Well, at Integral Spirituality, you see that humans are also divine, because humans are part of the finite world, which is ultimately divine, and it's the evolving expression. So humans are the same. And this applies, not just to integral people, to people who hold the integral worldview. It's that everyone is fundamentally divine by nature, regardless of what level of development they're at. And yes, this is it's a sort of easy conclusion to come to. It's an easy thing to perceive when you're at your best, but we're creatures of habit, and it's very easy to forget this, even if you've glimpsed it and you've, as I said, on your good days, you can see it and feel it and recognize it. Quite honestly, a lot of our mechanisms are not geared towards us seeing the divinity in other people. So that's another task, is to see the divinity in others, even when, our disposition is to not see that. My pet theory on this whole thing, which is not just a pet theory, it's sort of based on other sort of deductions people have made, but My pet theory on this, and I'm actually sort of stirring up a book around this topic at the moment, is that basically, as humans, because we are God, we are God, an expression of God, and we are conscious, and we have free will, we intuit perfection, divine perfection. Divinity is absolute perfection, right? And we intuit that whether we consider ourselves spiritually awakened or not, whether we consider ourselves spiritual or not, whether we can even sort of consciously tell ourselves that there is anything transcendent and there is anything divine, we all intuit divine perfection. And so in our lives, what we do is we basically pursue by various means, we try to perfect our lives. We try to perfect the world that we live in, our family, our work, our finances, our exercise, our body, our appearance, and all the rest of it. We try and perfect all that because we intuit divine perfection, and we are trying to sort of match our lives to that unconsciously, right? And this leads us to one of the inherent contradictions of integral spirituality. And it's just this, that in trying to become perfect, you basically are chasing your tail. Let me use an analogy here for you, and it's the analogy of the Big Bang. So what I believe is, I'm not necessarily saying the Big Bang didn't happen, but what I will claim is that the Big Bang is sort of a logical paradox, that it sort of undoes the idea of causality and the way that science tends to operate in terms of cause and effect, right? Supposedly the Big Bang is the first cause, okay? It's the first cause of all other cause and effect. But the thing is, that all only makes sense under the paradigm of cause and effect. So if the Big Bang is a cause, then there must have been an effect leading to the Big Bang, right? Now, if you say that there wasn't, then you're undermining the whole paradigm of cause and effect. If you say there is, then the Big Bang wasn't the Big Bang. It wasn't the first cause, right? So I'm not going to go into that. This is just an analogy. I mean, it's not an analogy. It's sort of like a different example that I'm using. And we could talk about that another day. But what I'm trying to get at here is this idea of perfection. You know, if the purpose of the universe, the finite manifest universe, is to evolve towards perfection, then by definition, this evolution must be asymptotic. We can never actually get to perfection. If the world is constantly evolving, then we never get to a point where it is not evolving, right? And so this is one of the contradictions in this worldview, in this idea that the world is constantly evolving and it is the divine expression of God. If God and divinity are absolute perfection and this is what we're ultimately evolving towards, there has to be a point where we stop and we say, no, we actually know what perfection is. And my way of resolving this, my understanding of this, and again, I'm cooking up an entire book around this, right? So just, I'm sort of grazing the surface. What my basic view is that at a certain point in your development, you realize that the manifest world can never be perfect, right? And you realize that divinity is what perfection actually is. And you stop trying to perfect the finite world, which you begin to realize is a kind of dream or mirage or illusion, right? And so you stop trying to perfect it, you stop chasing your tail. And so this is kind of, in my opinion, all stages of development, all stages of spiritual development, they sort of eat themselves alive. And I won't